Hello everyone, you're listening to an EBD Academy webinar on identifying and forecasting value drivers in biopharma valuations. Your speaker today is Joe Dillon. Joe is an experienced consultant in business development for pharma and biopharm. He is a trainer for the Advanced Business Development course, which runs ahead of BioEurope every year, and has recently developed a new course with EBD Academy on product valuation and deal structuring, which will be running next in March ahead of BioEurope Spring. I'll now hand you over to Joe. He'll be speaking for around about 20 minutes. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so please do submit those using the questions tab on your screen. Thanks very much. I'll hand you over to Joe now.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you all for attending our webinar today. My name is Joe Dillon. I'm with Dillon Capital Strategies. It's a consulting firm that deals with business development, strategy, interim senior management, and quite a bit of valuation and deal structuring in the biopharma industry with drugs, devices, and diagnostics for human health. So the topic of value drivers is something that's near and dear to my heart. So let's dive right in. We have quite a bit of material on the slides that I've provided today. I'm going to hit the high points of those slides, and then you'll be left with these slides to review later. And if you have any questions, my contact information is at the last slide, along with the link to the valuation course that we're doing next month, the day before the BioEurope Spring Conference. We hope some of you can join us for that. So the topics, we're going to first talk about the qualitative factors involved in the value of biopharma products. And then we'll talk about how to convert those potentially qualitative factors into quantitative factors to do evaluation. Following that, we'll talk about some of the usual suspects as the value drivers. And then at the end, as she mentioned, there is a Q&A session at the end, about 10 or maybe 5 minutes for that. So please send in your questions. We'd be happy to talk about them at the end. So from a qualitative standpoint, what really drives the value of biopharma products? And the first one is the more obvious of the ones on this list, and that's scarcity value. And it's simply supply and demand, serving unmet needs, and return on investment that's very strong, exciting, innovative technology, and those sorts of things. The list that's just about that, the list that's just below that lists some of the things that are details that might lead to scarcity value, and it's basically all about differentiating your product from other products that might make it more valuable. The next one down is one that I see that's missed by the sell side, and by the way, when I use the term sell side, I'm talking about usually the innovator companies, the smaller biotechs, smaller technology companies and devices and diagnostics, and their plan is to later sell or license that technology to the buy side, which are typically the larger companies that commercialize products. But the buy side understands franchise very well. A large company, say for instance Pfizer, could probably afford to be in all therapeutic areas, but they choose not to because they understand quite well the franchise strategy rule that you focus your efforts in particular areas. And they develop pretty significant economies of scale by doing that. So if you're on the sell side and you're pitching your technology to a larger company on the buy side, it's a very good idea to know where does your product or your technology fit in their franchise strategy. The better a fit it is to their strategy, the more valuable it will be to them. The next is time value of money, and yes, time is money. We do valuations using the discounted cash flow, which does a really good job of differentiating the value of payments and cash flow depending on when they come in the timeline. And we use the discount rate to measure that, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. Risk mitigation is another one towards the bottom here. It's all about risk and reward. So when we talk about reward in our industry, there's a lot of risk that comes with trying to get that reward. So we talk about that in terms of probability of technical success, which is also the probability of getting a marketing approval for our product. So there are probably other ones that you've thought of as I went through this list, but we've hit some of the big ones here. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and talk about how do we take some of these potentially qualitative variables and make them quantitative. And that's the real difference between doing a really good valuation that's defendable and that's the true value of a product, and a valuation that maybe isn't such a true value of the product. And that's being able to convert qualitative factors and make them quantitative. So the main drivers are listed towards the top, and we'll talk about those today. Some of the other drivers are listed towards the bottom that I'll mention here in a minute. The main drivers usually are gross revenue, and that's made up of both price and units, R&D costs, sales and marketing expenses. Yes, we see taxes here. Sometimes tax is the highest highest value item on a cash flow. So we have to do this after tax, just like your paycheck. You take home your after-tax pay. Companies take home their after-tax cash flows. And we'll talk about discount rate and probability of success as well. Other factors that we're not going to talk about today, but during the course, the valuation course, we talk about it a little bit more. One of those is cost of goods, and oftentimes this is a relatively low figure compared to the entire cash flow of a particular product. But some products, this could be quite high. For instance, biologics in some cases, antibody drug conjugates sometimes can have a very high cost per dose. So we need to pay attention to this. Rebates, allowances, returns, this is something that sometimes gets forgotten in cash flows, but these can be quite high. These are basically discounts that are provided by the seller of a good to the supply chain, which is made up of the warehouses and drugstores and entities like that. Discounts and rebates and allowances can add up to 10, 20, 30, and I've seen even 40 or 50% of the list price. So sometimes these need to be considered very seriously. Administrative operating expenses, usually not so much. Capital spending, my experience has been in valuations that capital spending is usually either next to nothing or it's a lot, not a whole lot of in between. Oftentimes there's not a lot of material capital spending that needs to be made before marketing a product, and sometimes it can be quite high. For instance, if you have to build a plant to manufacture the goods. So how do we figure out which of these variables are sensitive? I do a lot of this in my head. After having done a lot of these, I can get a sense from it, doing different scenarios, playing around with my valuation model, but you can chart it like we have done here. This is a very simple way to chart sensitivity. And what I've done here is we've taken the valuation, and you can see this dotted line, that's the base case. So the base case valuation in this particular example is about $480 million risk-adjusted net present value. And what I did was take each variable one at a time, and for instance, let's talk about units. So what if units are 20% greater than my base case? Okay, we have a higher valuation. What if units are 20% less than my base case, which of course is going to give us a lower valuation. So we get this steep line, and that indicates that this is a sensitive variable. So in the case of, this is price here, the orange line, very sensitive. It swings the valuation by 70% when we alter it. The ones that are less sensitive, these over here, we've got R&D costs, sales and marketing, and cost of goods. In this case, I'm going to focus a little bit less time on these. You know, obviously I want to get them pretty close, but I'm really more concerned about getting these sensitive variables right. But it's not always the case that it's just those four. Here's another valuation. The base case here is about $34 million, again, risk-adjusted net present value. And as usual, revenue and discount rate are very sensitive. Revenue swings at 181% when I do this -20 or +20 type of a scenario. But in this case, sales and marketing expense and R&D costs are quite significant. They swing this valuation 62% plus or minus. So in this case, I had to pay special attention to these to make sure I got them right. I also had to pay very close attention to making sure that I wasn't overestimating my revenue, because I could easily get a negative valuation. So how do we forecast these variables. So revenue forecasting can be done basically in two different ways. There's a variety of methodologies, but they usually fall into these two buckets. We have the market-based here in the middle, and then up top is the patient-based, which is just what it sounds like. It's based on patients, epidemiology, prevalence, numbers of patients seeing doctors, how do the doctors treat those patients, how do the patients react to that treatment, and the bottom line is basically the number of patients using your product and multiply that times how often they use it during a year and the price, and you have a revenue forecast. Down here in the market base is actually done quite differently and usually comes up with a different number than if you use patient-based for various reasons. But we look at the competitive set. So for instance, you have a product that you think is going to be moderately better than product X, which is already on the market. You can find out the revenue for product X by a variety of different ways. And let's say it's $350 million per year. You might be able to say, well, we might be able to generate $380 or $400 million per year. So that's basing your revenue on the market. What gets tricky with the competitive set is if you're working on products in development, or most any product for that matter, you have other products in development that during the time that your product is on the market, those products might launch. So you have to go in and look at what's in development, make an estimation of what's going to launch, and estimate how then your product will be positioned in the then current competitive set. Then we think about pricing, reimbursement, and market life cycle with those. So moving on to development costs, this surprises some of my clients if a lot of them are very early stage, preclinical, maybe phase 1, and we're doing evaluation. I say, well, have you done any estimates of development costs through approval? And oftentimes the answer is no, we don't plan to do that development. We're going to out-license this. But if you're going to use a valuation that has future revenue as a basis for valuation, you also have to have in there the cost that is going to be incurred in order to get that revenue in the future. So with the sell side, when we usually have less budget, less time, and less of a lot of things to get valuations done, I'll oftentimes use standards for development costs. I'll go out to the internet on a regular basis and look for new studies for average costs of drug development. They're pretty easy to find. What I will say is be real careful. Some of these studies, the numbers are, let's say, less useful than others. So always read the study and understand where these numbers come from before you use them. And then fit them to your program, because your program is probably not average. If you're a new untested mechanism of action, or if you're in a disease that might tend to have long clinical trials or many patients in the clinical trials, you're probably going to have a longer timeline and higher development cost. If you're repurposing a drug, or in other ways have a drug that's going to require shorter clinical trials, fewer studies, or less patients, then you're probably going to be less than average. So that's using standards. If you're on the buy side and you're getting serious about a deal, and then you're going to have to go to your R&D department to get budget allocation, you're probably going to have to do what I call a detailed buildup. And this can be quite a bit of work where you're going in and you're looking at full-time equivalents and how many scientists and how many sites, how many patients, and you basically build this up study by study, phase by phase. The most important thing though on this slide is here at the bottom, underlined. Keep the development plan consistent with what's needed to achieve the target product profile. So the target product profile is basically what you think the product is going to be when it launches. And the sell side is often very optimistic about that, and they might be right. And they may be claiming, exceedingly good efficacy or maybe a really good safety profile compared to other products. But what you need to do is, if you're touting a very optimistic target product profile, you also have to put in the cost and timeline for a development plan that will generate the data to support those claims. So if we go down to Salesforce expense, I have a model that I use for this that makes this easy for me, at least. And I like to build this up based on how many sales reps will be required. And the easiest way I've found to do that is to find out what doctors do we need to go detail. And in this case, I have PCPs or general practitioners and 3 different kinds of specialists. If you have a device or a diagnostic, maybe you're going to clinics or hospitals, so you would have those listed here. And how many of them are there? How are you going to penetrate into that particular population? For instance, PCPs, we're going to talk to 15% of all of them, and so on. You do some simple math, and here we've come up with about 20,000 physicians that need to be detailed. And I have another model that comes up with this number that, for lack of a better name, I call the Salesforce conversion factor. And it's based on a variety of variables that tells me, based on that many physicians that need to be detailed, how many reps are required. And that's this 173. In this particular case, those sales reps were going to be detailing 2 products. So I'm only going to allocate then half of their cost to this one product, because they're detailing 2 products. So it wouldn't be fair to allocate the entire cost to them. So we come up with basically full-time equivalents down here. Here's a fully burdened cost of the sales rep, which includes the support of the whole sales group, and a budget of $22 million. So fairly straightforward step by step. Marketing expense is different in a lot of ways. I build this up by line item forecasting. I have a model that lists out all of the different things, or all of the different material things that a marketing group might spend money on to market a product. And a lot of these you can come up in your own head. You know, what do marketing companies or marketing departments spend money on? You know, do we have to do technical journal advertising? Are we going to be in consumer magazines? Do we have to do medical marketing? We have to support the sales force with materials and props and those sorts of things. And in the middle there, don't forget about direct consumer advertising, especially in the US. The last valuation I did was for a large pharma company in a product in a market where the competitors were doing direct consumer television advertising. And in a few years of that forecast, we had just television advertising over $100 million per year. I don't recommend using standards, but some people do. If you do, some of them use a standard of 10 to 15% of revenue for marketing expense. The problem with this is 10 to 15% of revenue is something that's a number that's going to float with revenue, but we know that it gets out of alignment early after a launch. In the first year or 2 or 3 after launch, it's usually much more than 10 to 15%. And then late in the life cycle of a drug, it's usually less than 10 to 15%. So if you're going to use a standard, make sure that you're making some adjustments to it. Probability of technical success, you know, obviously we have to do this. We're in a risky industry. Some programs are less risky than others. So we need to sensitize our valuations to risk so that we can differentiate between risky programs and less risky programs. So I do use standards in probability of success, unless we have a lot of other information. But in here, we have a standard, 25%. This one happens to come from Professor Damasi at Tufts University. And I believe this was a phase 1 compound in a particular therapeutic area. The average was 25% probability of success. So we knew our product wasn't average. So I go through a list of questions that I'll ask the technical folks. How easy is this, or how hard is this going to be to develop? And then they rate it on a scale of 1 to 4. So here there's rating on a variety of factors. Down here towards the end, this is the tail end of the regulatory section. Basically, what is the FDA going to think of this? What is the EMEA going to think of this? So we have a rating of 1.9, which is lower than the average of the scale of 2.5. So we can take this rating and adjust the standard, and we come up with 19% probability of success for this particular asset. And those of you that do a lot of valuations know that the value of a 25% probability of success program, as opposed to valuing it at 19% probability, There's going to be a big difference between those two valuations. So this is important. Then the last part is discount rate. Which rate do you use? So I'm going to skip all the way down to hurdle rate. This is the rate that is most often used in valuations. And what the hurdle rate is basically the company in question, they know or they calculate their weighted average cost of capital. Somebody in Treasury has probably calculated this. And that's basically, what does it cost us to attract capital? So they know to make a hurdle rate, they want to make money on their money. The Treasury people will call that positive leverage. So they say arbitrarily, usually, well, if money costs us 6%, then we want a minimum rate of return, which is what the hurdle rate represents, a minimum rate of return of, let's say, 12%. So a little bit arbitrary, but then using a discount rate at 12%, they know that all of their valuations, if they're above zero, are returning 12% or better. Now, what's very important, though, is this last bullet underlined. Use the discount rate applicable to the company making the future investments. And what this means is, if you're a sell-side company, let's say a biotech company, and you plan to take your preclinical program, license it out to a larger company, let's say a big pharma company, and the big pharma company is going to do all of the development. They're going to pay for all of the buildup of the sales force and the commercialization. Basically, all of the future cash flows are coming from that partner, the bigger company. You will use the discount rate for the bigger company, not your own. You'll use the discount rate of the bigger company. The reason for that is a financial reason. That is, using the discount rate of the larger company matches the discount rate to the capital that is going to be deployed in the future to generate the value of that asset. So it's the big company's capital, we'll use the big company's rate. So that's it. I know that was pretty fast. We go through this with a lot more detail in the course, but hopefully the slides will provide you some background, and we're ready for some questions. Do we have any?
Thanks, Joe. A few people have asked if there will be a copy of this webinar disseminated. There will be. We have recorded it, and we will send that to everyone who registered. One question coming in. For a new fund without any investments yet, how do you forecast the potential value of IO preclinical phase 1, phase 2A portfolio and return for LPs? Do you create a scenario or evaluation for each potential investment and hypothetical return, like a build-up?
Yeah, if I understand that correctly, this would be a valuation prior to understanding what the particular assets were. That's going to be pretty much of a swag, because you don't know what the assets are. One preclinical asset can be very, very, very different from another preclinical asset. My approach would be to talk to that particular fund and ask them what their target is going to be. Are you looking for orphan drugs? Are you looking for CNS drugs? And try to get a feel for what particular kind of preclinical or phase 1 assets do you believe will be coming into your portfolio, and then take some examples of those types of assets and do a top line valuation of those. And that way you're going to have a little bit better basis for the valuation that you'll be sharing with your GPs. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, they said it did. Another question, how do I get the discount rate of the buyer?
Yes, that's always the question. I knew somebody would ask that. If the buyer, generally speaking, if the buyer is a large company, especially if they're multi-country oriented companies, so they're operating globally or in a variety of areas, you can really assume that their discount rate is probably somewhere in the 10 to 12% range. If inflation were to tick up by a couple of percent, then I might say that range is somewhere more like 12 to 15. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is even more clever. is a lot of these companies are public companies. One of the accounting notes in the 10K, if this is a public company that does a 10K or a similar submission in, let's say, a European exchange, you can find in the accounting notes almost always their weighted average cost of capital, and sometimes you will even find their hurdle rate or their nominal discount rate used for analyses will be in an accounting note. So that's one way to do it. But in general, if you're going to be talking to a variety of potential partners, and they're all larger companies, use something between 12 and, or let's say, 9 and 15%.
Okay, a follow-up question. Why might the discount rate be a sensitive variable?
Yeah, the sensitive variable of the discount rate is based on the fact that the calculation that the discount rate is used in the formula involves a exponent in that particular formula. And because it has an exponent in it, two things happen. One is it has a acceleration effect when you start to move the other variables. So as discount rate is increased, it is actually a curvilinear accelerating increase. And if you noticed in those spider charts, the line for discount rate, given those three scenarios, the high, the low, and the medium, it was not a straight line. Also, the discount rate is discounting every cash flow for every year. So it is the one rate that applies itself to every single factor in the valuation. So it always is, gosh, always in the top 3 of the most sensitive variables for those reasons. And for similar reasons, that's why probability of success is such a sensitive variable, because it is applied to all other variables.
Okay, great. We've just got a number of questions coming in, so we'll get through as many as possible in the time. Someone asks, how do you account for cannibalization in the valuation model?
That's a really good question. There's a variety of ways to answer that, and I hope I picked the right one. The example that I'm going to give is if you are intending to launch a product that will cannibalize another product that you own, so that would be cannibalization as opposed to market stealing. What you're really going to have to do is market research. And I'm going to use, hopefully you're in the drugs for human health industry, I'm going to use a drug as an example. If you were to launch an improved version of a drug, you know that it's going to cannibalize the sales of your old drug, but you also know from experience that it's not going to eliminate the sales of your old drug. That's why the old one is rarely taken off the market unless there's some kind of issue with it. The best way to figure out what the cannibalization rate will be would be to talk to whoever's using the product. In this case, it would be the doctors, and get a sense for what patients you'll be moving this drug over to and at what rate. Doctors are usually pretty reticent to change the drug being given to a patient if that patient has a very serious disease and they've become stabilized. So you get slower cannibalization. When it's easier to switch patients, you get faster cannibalization. So talk to the docs.
We're out of time, so I'll just pick one more question. On slide 3, you talk about market share based on competition. Do you have a method to adjust for attrition of competitors in development? For example, is it possible to estimate competitors' attrition rate in development to estimate numbers of competitors in the market?
It is. One way to do that would be simply by probability of success. If you're looking at a bunch of phase 1 products, you can probably assume that only 1 out of 5 at best of those are going to hit the market, just using standard probabilities of success. That's the easy way to do it. It's a little bit less defendable. A more defendable way to do that would be to look at the phase 2 and phase 3 products pretty closely and look at the data of the ones that are going to be probably the I guess, more viable competitors for your product, and make your own estimation whether you think they're going to launch. It's a very imperfect process, just like it is to come up with your own probability of success in your program. When you're talking about preclinical programs, I do a lot of work in CNS and oncology. And when you're looking at the pipeline of CNS and oncology, for instance, let's say you're looking at rheumatoid arthritis or one of the big diseases in CNS and solid tumors and oncology, you're going to find hundreds potentially of preclinical products. You can't really go through hundreds of those unless you've got a ton of time. In that case, I usually will just use an arbitrary factor for competitive stealing every few years in my forecast to say, I don't know who it's going to be, but one of these 100 products is probably going to hit the market, and it's probably it's going to depend on how strong an asset that I'm forecasting. If it's seated very strongly, I might just say new entrants might only take 1 or 2% of my market share. If I have an average asset, I might think that they might take 2, 3, 4, 5%. So it's an estimation thing, but you've got to put something in there as a placeholder.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much, Joe. We're over time now. I'm conscious of that. So thank you, everyone who attended today. And thanks again, Joe, for your presentation.
You're quite welcome. Thank you all for joining us.